Welcome to the Green Horizon Summit. My name is Roger Gifford and I'm chair of the Green Finance Institute. And over the next 3 days, you're going to hear a lot of world leaders, government figures, financiers, corporate business people talking about the need to make a case for action in the nature-related and the green finance-related areas. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you. I hope you can stick with us as much as you can for these 3 days, and I look forward to sharing the results with you afterwards.
A 3-day green finance extravaganza where we'll be hosting, alongside the City of London Corporation and the World Economic Forum, some of the most senior leaders from across business, finance, government, academia and philanthropy to discuss practical solutions and innovation in green finance, an important staging post on the road to COP26.
I think the level of attendance today shows the level of concern at this major issue.
For generations, scientists have been warning of the risks of unmitigated climate change. And 5 years after the Paris Agreement, we now have the tools and strategies we need to respond, adapt, and overcome this threat too. By taking part in the Green Horizon Summit, they can start working together, mobilizing capital, and continue the sustainable revolution to tackle climate change, our greatest challenge yet.
Hello and good morning. It's a typical autumn day here in the City of London, which means it may rain later, so it's great you can join us for the Green Horizons Summit virtually. I'm Roger Gifford, working with SEB in the City of London, and I also chair the UK's Green Finance Institute, one of the co-hosts of this event with the City of London, and I am your chair for this summit. We have an action-packed agenda for the next 3 days with some of the top names and minds in government and finance, joining us for what promises to be a series of lively debates and discussions. Our focus is to answer the question at the heart of the lead up to COP26. How do we mobilize the finance needed to make net zero a reality? It's a big question and one that many here in London and around the world are hard at work to solve. So to welcome you all here, may I ask the Lord Mayor of London, William Russell, to open the summit.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Green Horizons Summit. These are sobering circumstances in which we find ourselves here in London and around the world. While the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to unfold and shape our immediate future, we remain united in determination to meet this challenge. It is testament to our commitment and adaptability that so many of you are able to join us today when COP26 was originally scheduled. Together, we represent over 90 countries and countless aspirations. Although tempting to focus on the short term, today we must turn to our long-term future and prosperity. For the battle for the future will not just be with COVID-19, but with the impacts of climate change. 5 years ago, Mark Carney laid down a challenge to the financial services industry. He described climate change as the tragedy of the horizon, with physical and transition risk manifesting beyond the planning horizons of financial institutions, the business cycle, and the political cycle. Mark challenged us all to break the tragedy of their horizon by aligning the data and information flows at the heart of finance with climate-related risks. In the 5 years since, much has changed. The Paris Agreement has given us political consensus and a long-term target, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC has given us scientific consensus and a trajectory. A Paris-aligned future means achieving net zero by 2050. National governments are giving us measurable goals. According to Bloomberg, about 60% of global CO2 emissions are now covered by a net zero commitment. And I look forward to a time early next year when this reaches 75%. As the US rejoins the Paris Agreement and President-elect Joe Biden advances his climate and recovery plans. Financial regulators have also given us clear expectations. Climate risks are financially material and must be managed by financial institutions. And the TCFD, the NGFS, and others have given us the tools to respond. Climate-related financial risks must be disclosed. Scenario analysis can tackle the uncertainty. We are now in a world where you're as likely to hear climate risk and response discussed in boardrooms as you are to debate strategy and profit. For now, we understand they are inextricably linked. The science tells us that if we do not act now, climate tipping points threaten to rapidly and irreversibly alter our planetary ecosystem. Today, we stand at a tipping point for finance. the point at which we can trigger an everlasting cycle of innovation and investment for net zero. Although finance is beginning to power towards a net zero and climate resilient future, we are not yet firing on all cylinders and not in all markets. We have yet to reach a future in which every financial decision takes climate change into account. A future in which national and corporate transition plans are clear and capitalized. Or a future in which green finance is simply called finance. Our window to act is finite and closing quickly. Each and every one of us understands this. Institutions like our sponsors Barclays and 91 are already acting fast to capture the opportunities aligned with the transition. As we know, one of the greatest global economic transformations looms before us. Every sector of the economy must evolve, from construction to manufacturing, transport, food and clothing, services and power. As we all know, this requires a transformation in every country, from developed markets to emerging economies to unrated and frontier nations, all within a few short decades. This transformation cannot be a success if we do not work together across the public and private sectors, across the financial and real economy, across all 90 countries here today. We need a sophisticated dialogue that captures all of policy and regulation, capital markets, and the changing demands of investors, from retail savers to global asset managers. We know this is essential to raise and move the capital we need. That is why the City of London, together with the Green Finance Institute and with the support of the World Economic Forum, are hosting today's Green Summit live from Mansion House. Over the next 3 days, we will hear from political leaders, major financial institutions, leading regulators and corporates, all at the coalface of this transition. Their views are clear. We have the tools and capabilities to tackle this transition, but we must act now. So today, I would encourage you, ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, to listen, to engage, and most importantly, to consider what we can do together in the coming 12 months. Now, this morning, we are in for a treat. In quick succession, we will hear Mark Carney, Christine Lagarde, Kristalina Georgieva, and Paolo Gentiloni, all sharing their views on what we need to do to drive towards a green recovery. We will then hear from the private sector, with John Green from 91 and a panel with Jez Staley, Liv Garfield, David Schwimmer, and Angela Darlington on how finance can mobilize to support the recovery. Finally, we will hear from the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, and FCA Chief Nihal Rathi for their take on managing climate risk in a time of radical uncertainty. But first, let me hand you over to Mark Carney.
My Lord Mayor, thank you for your hospitality and for your leadership. It was only in February that, emboldened by Sir David Attenborough, we met in a packed Guildhall to map the road to Glasgow. Almost immediately, COVID intervened. The journey went virtual and its timetable was extended. And some might have become concerned. But the resolve of the private sector, the resolve of private finance, has redoubled. We've made considerable progress and momentum is growing. Our destination remains the same. The COVID crisis has not altered that. In fact, what COVID has done, this tragedy has exposed the problems with undervaluing resilience, ignoring systemic risks, and not investing up front. And so it is with climate change, a crisis that involves the entire world and from which no one will be able to self-isolate. COVID is forcing a social reset for countries and a strategic reset for companies. Society is placing a greater value on resilience and on sustainability. 126 governments have now committed to net zero, including 3 global giants, China, Japan, and South Korea, in the last few weeks. And more countries are recognizing that green stimulus is essential. Building a sustainable future will be capital intensive after a period when there's been too little investment. It will be job heavy when unemployment is soaring. It's what the world needs for its future, and it's what we all need right now. Given the wholesale shift in economic and social drivers of value since COVID, it will be a rare company whose pre-crisis strategy remains optimal. And so businesses of all stripes increasingly recognize that changing consumer preferences and new climate policies are creating the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. The leaders are publishing their transition plans for net zero. There's now 500 major companies that have science-based targets, and there's a further 500 in the pipeline. By Glasgow, net zero transition plans will become the norm for large companies. Private finance will fund the initiatives and innovation of these plans, provided that private finance has the necessary information and the tools and markets. And that's why our objective for COP26 is to build the framework so that every financial decision can take climate change into account. We're publishing today our COP26 private finance strategy to build a market in that transition. It rests on 4 pillars, 3 R's, comprehensive climate reporting, a transformation in climate risk management, and mainstreaming of climate returns, and 1M, creating new markets to mobilize private capital, especially private capital and investment into emerging and developing economies. Now, I want to spend the balance of my time outlining the progress that has been made since February in the Guildhall and setting out what more needs to be done by the time we arrive in Glasgow. Let me start with reporting. We all know what gets measured gets managed, and companies need to report systematically their climate-related financial. Risks and opportunities that climate change poses to their business models. And okay. To recap, investors representing over 140 trillion of assets are demanding this information and disclosure in line with TCFD. They're also calling on companies to disclose whether or not the assumptions in their financial statements are compatible with the Paris Agreement. With Ireland's announcement last week, over 60 countries and national authorities now support the TCFD, and the most forward-looking are enshrining it in law, with New Zealand leading the way. Regulators are moving as well. The FCA in the UK has completed its consultation on comply or explain disclosure obligations, and as the Lord Mayor just said, you'll hear more from the CEO later in this summit. Since February, guidance from international standard setters has sharpened. The IASB has made clear that where climate change risk is considered material, the standards already require that is disclosed in mainstream financial statements. And the IAASB's guidance to auditors shows that climate change is an issue that must be regularly assessed by the accountancy and audit professions. So allow me to translate. We have governments setting the goal of net zero. We have over $100 trillion of capital demanding action. At a minimum, companies must disclose whether the assumptions in their accounts are aligned with Paris. In other words, are they joining us on the road to Glasgow or not? Now, the best companies are responding. Almost half of companies with market capitalization greater than 10 billion are disclosing in line with most of the TCFD recommendations. But most isn't yet enough. We need full disclosure, and we need full disclosure particularly about forward-looking strategies. And this underscores the need to make climate-related disclosures mandatory. Now, there are many routes to mandatory, and they are complementary, but the important thing is to agree the direction of travel. And so we're calling on governments by Glasgow to use the TCFD as the starting point for any mandatory disclosure regime. Secondly, to publish pathways to show how authorities in their respective jurisdictions will be responsible for implementing climate-related reporting rules. And thirdly, to work with international standard setters, particularly the IFRS Foundation. And that's the body responsible for the accounting rules in over 140 jurisdictions. And it is currently consulting on sustainability standards and how they might be developed. And we would urge all companies, particularly in the financial sector, to engage in that consultation. Now let me turn to the second R, which is risk. Like in the case of reporting, there has been considerable progress since we met in the Guildhall in February. The NGFS, the group of central banks and supervisory authorities, has grown to over 75 members, accounting for jurisdictions that represent over 2/3 of global emissions. It's now developed standards for supervision and the management of climate risks, as well as approaches for climate stress testing and central bank policies for climate change. 14 of those authorities, major authorities, are issuing guidance to major banks and insurers. The NGFS has published its set of scenarios for climate stress testing, which will allow investors to compare results and readily differentiate the strategic resilience of companies they lend to and insure. 18 central banks have committed to running climate stress testing, and the NGFS scenarios will be important to aligning these approaches and reduce the burden on firms and allowing comparison across jurisdiction. And you'll hear more about these approaches when the Governor of the Bank of England speaks later this morning. International authorities are also starting to embed this approach. The IMF included the impact of climate-related financial risks in its most recent financial sector assessment of Norway, and we'd encourage the IMF to now mainstream this approach. And in recent months, as you heard from the Lord Mayor, some of the world's largest banks, including Barclays, HSBC, and Morgan Stanley, have committed to net zero by 2050 on a Scope 3 basis, which means bringing all of their financed emissions in line with net zero. For Glasgow, we're calling on more firms to use these NGFS scenarios, more central banks to conduct climate stress tests, and to develop and disclose and manage the climate risks on their balance sheets. Turning to returns. Given that climate change is an existential risk, it follows that those companies that are part of the solution to climate change will create enormous value. The financial sector is increasingly focused on this opportunity of a lifetime. In fact, it's an opportunity for a lifetime. As one illustration, the assets under management for the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment have grown over 20% this year to over $100 trillion. And valuations in the market are beginning to Goldman Sachs estimates that the implied carbon price for long-term oil projects is around $80 a ton, and that hurdle rates for renewable power investment are 1/4 of that of long-term oil developments. Investors are increasingly calling as a result for credible transition plans from oil companies. Climate Action 100 Plus, a group of 500 institutional investors controlling almost $50 trillion of assets, recently demanded that the world's 160 largest emitters that count for more than 3/4 of global industrial emissions, publish their strategies to reach net zero by 2050. And on the road to Glasgow, investors are clarifying those expectations for those plans, with emerging best practice being publishing plans that include scopes 1, 2, and ideally 3 targets, balancing absolute emissions with appropriate offsets, governing the management of those risks at the board level, and tying executive compensation to their achievement. Transition plans will reveal the leaders and laggards on the road to Glasgow. But rather than have authorities be overly prescriptive on plans, it may be desirable to have investors have a say on transition. In other words, an automatic annual advisory vote on transition plans, just as they have a say on pay. This would establish a critical link between responsibility, accountability, and sustainability. Now, over time, investors won't just judge company transition plans, they too shall be judged. Investors should disclose how closely their portfolios are aligned with the transition to net zero. And some of the world's largest and most influential asset owners are already doing that. The members of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, 5 trillion of assets, have committed to manage down their carbon footprints by up to 29% on a Scope 3 basis by 2025, and to be net zero compliant by 2050. And such a metrics-based approach will become increasingly common. So one of the challenges by Glasgow is for investors to agree how best to demonstrate how their clients' investments are aligned with climate targets. A measure of portfolio alignment needs to be forward-looking, it needs to be anchored in real-world targets, and it needs to be dynamic. And these are the criteria that will ensure that investors are engaged with companies that are seeking to decarbonize, because, and I mean all companies, because we will not get to net zero in a niche. It requires a whole economy transition. Now, there are several ways to measure who's on the right and wrong side of climate history. And today, the Measuring Portfolio Alignment report, published by a private sector team led by David Blood, the founder of Generation Investment Management, assesses various metrics, including the percentage of assets that are net zero aligned, secondly, transition progress against scientifically determined transition pathways that vary by sector, and thirdly, calculation of a portfolio warming metric to assess the quality of those plans. Over the next 12 months on the road to Glasgow, the industry should use David's report as a basis for discussion and consensus on the most useful measurement. And as you'll hear from Richard Curtis later in the summit, investors will need transparent and readily understandable answers when their clients ask whether their money is being invested in line with their values. The challenge to the industry is to make a material and meaningful metric so that people can make their money matter. Turning to last pillar, mobilization. Climate change is clearly a global challenge. Much of the critical investment will take place in emerging and in developing economies. In fact, probably 3/4 of the infrastructure investment, the 3.5 trillion of annual infrastructure investment that's required for decades, will happen there. So we need to turn billions of public capital into trillions of private capital. Part of this will be through Scope 3 emissions, transition plans. Part will be through investing to mitigate physical risks by increasing infrastructure investment, resilient infrastructure investment, and widening insurance cover. Part will be through new platforms such as the GISD for blended finance. And part will be through the creation of new markets, particularly one for carbon offsets. As more and more companies commit to net zero, demand for credible and verifiable offsets will soar. And the most cost-effective of these, with the greatest emission reduction potential, will be in emerging and developing economies. These can generate large flows of capital for many decades. Now, currently, that market doesn't properly exist. It's opaque, it's cumbersome, it's fragmented. The amount of offsets last year was just over $300 million. In order to conserve the carbon budget, we need to spell million with a B. For finance to flow to these projects, we need professional, transparent, and resilient market. So we put together a group of experts under the leadership of Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered, overseen by Annette Nazareth, former SEC commissioner and now Davis Polk, and under the sponsorship of the Institute for International Finance and Tim Adams. This group has been moving at lightning speed, and it's on track to deliver a blueprint for a professional carbon offset market early next year. Tomorrow they'll launch the consultation for that blueprint, and we're calling on all interested parties to engage. So to conclude, I've only highlighted a few of the vehicles on the caravan of private finance towards Glasgow, and you can learn more about them in the detailed private finance strategy published today. But I want to finish by thanking the very many of you from thousands of organizations around the world in the private sector, in the public sector, and NGOs that are working tirelessly to make this journey a success. Your ideas, energy, and innovation are critical. My Lord Mayor, there's an old proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The private sector has gone a long way in a short period of time. It's moving fast on the road to Glasgow. With the UK and Italian presidencies of COP26, the G7 and G20 next year, governments now have a unique opportunity to amplify these efforts and ensure that we go far towards our objective of net zero. Thank you. Now with that, it's my very great honor to hand over to the President of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, someone whose innovation, intelligence, and drive has led the mainstreaming of sustainable finance and to whose debt we all owe. So with that, I give you President Lagarde.
Thank you so much, Mark, and good morning. I would like to thank the City of London, the Green Institute for Finance, or the Green Finance Institute, and indeed the World Economic Forum. Mark, I would like to just pay tribute to your leadership, to the excellent introduction that you have outlined for us. And I feel like resting my case because in many ways I will simply complement many of the points that you have made in a very modest way from my end. The economic challenges of the climate transition are phenomenal. And often I ask myself, what is the cause? Survival. And I ask myself, who is responsible? All. And then I ask myself, how much does it cost? A lot. But nothing that we cannot afford, because the cause is our survival. Now, of course, as we all know, a global and accurate price on emissions that would reflect the true underlying climatic and economic externality remains vital to provide the right incentives. But short of that, which I hope will come, and not at around $2 to $5 per ton, financial markets and institutions can provide powerful and complementary impetus for change. It is crucial that funds be channeled correctly to underpin and accelerate an orderly transition. Just to give you an idea about the magnitude we're talking about, in the European Union only, an additional 470 billion euros would be needed annually. To that end, the two priorities that I would like to talk about today fall in under the headline of information, which Mark has talked about quite a lot, and innovation. More information is indeed essential for financial market participants to understand the link between underlying economic activity and its environmental impact. And financial support is indeed vital for the many innovations that are necessary for the transition. So let's talk about information first. At the moment, information on the sustainability of financial products, when available, is at best inconsistent, largely incomparable, and at times unreliable. And that means that climate risks are not adequately priced, posing challenges for financial stability. This is what I would call the pricing gap. We have in Europe a recent stress test that were carried out by the Dutch National Bank and the ESRB, and they point to marked impairments for banks and other financial institutions should a disorderly transition occur. So we're not quite ready. Disclosures of climate-related information using standardized and commonly agreed definitions, combined with improved data quality, can help bridge that pricing gap that I just mentioned. One prominent example is the framework that was developed by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that gave birth to the TCFD. Now, in addition to the 60 countries mentioned by Mark, around 1,500 entities have now endorsed TCFD recommendations, representing a combined market capitalization of $12.6 trillion, and the supporting financial firms being responsible for assets of nearly $150 trillion. In the European Union, reporting is covered by something that we call the NFRD, which is the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. But, believe it or not, climate change information remains optional, in part because the financial impact is still not well understood. Yet, while TCFD and the NFRD are the reference frameworks, there are plenty of other disclosure and reporting frameworks, and we're talking about dozens and dozens of them, and it multiplies requirements and increases reporting costs. So harmonization efforts are crucial to ensure a proper disclosure of climate-related information. Actually, a review of the NFRD at the European level is currently ongoing, and the ECB will participate in that. We need a leap forward in reaching common technical reporting standards and increased data availability at a granular level, including, as mentioned by Mark, adopting forward-looking and dynamic climate indicators. In that regard, I'm really happy that the European Taxonomy Regulation that entered into force on July the 12th this year marks an important milestone. More to be done, but it's a good one, because it enables a consistent way to classify green activities. More to be done, because it needs to be matched by a widely accepted and applied taxonomy of carbon-intensive activities. Such moves would permit both lower reporting costs for firms and greater ability for financial markets to correctly analyze and price risks. Moreover, it is essential that climate risks are included consistently and transparently into credit ratings if all investors are to incorporate such risks fully into their investment decisions. Rating gap? Well, the recent initiatives by credit rating agencies are certainly moving in the right direction, but still far too short of what is required. Making further progress may involve recognizing the obstacles they face, including insufficient information on climate exposures of rated entities. In this regard, more and better disclosures would support rating agencies in their effort. The Eurosystem and the ECB at the center, by the way, all members of the NGFS, has advocated for mandatory disclosures of climate-related risks from a far greater number of companies, including non-listed entities. Climate change and its impact on monetary policy will be reviewed in depth as part of the ECB's ongoing strategy review. And interestingly enough, this exercise will be completed around the time when the new taxonomy regulation comes into effect in January 2022. More about that later. But achieving a successful transition to a carbon-neutral world requires more than just understanding the risks. It involves the wholesale transformation of the economy. Or as Lord Mayor said, we don't need to talk about the green economy one day. We only talk about the economy. We don't talk about green finance, we talk about finance. Innovation, which is what I want to talk about now, is needed to reduce energy intensity, to boost the effectiveness of renewable energy sources, and to scale up capacity for carbon capture and removal. There is a substantial role for the financial sector to play in fueling and accelerating the development of new firms and new sources of growth. By the way, and this is not incidental, this is critically important. In that way, if we can manage that properly, people employed currently in sunset industries can then transition to new sustainable jobs that will become even more apparent and more urgent as we're going through this pandemic at the moment. Let me say a few words about the European Union, because it has been at the forefront of the push for green finance. Europe is already the biggest region of issuance of green bonds and accounts for 48% of the outstanding volume and nearly half of green bonds today in the world are denominated in euros. The outstanding amount of green bonds issued by euro area residents has grown tenfold since 2015. And obviously, the issuance by the European Commission on behalf of Europe under the Recovery and Resilience Fund will push those numbers up.